Thank you all for being here again tonight. Last week we talked about some of what the planning board does and some of and we led into tonight by passing out some plans from a project and giving you excerpts of some of the development regulations that all of the boards and committees utilize. I think what we want to do tonight is guide you through sort of a very abbreviated, very streamlined process of how each of the boards, each of the land use boards and committees would review an application. How many of you have already looked at the plans a little bit? Did anybody recognize the project location? Okay. People are familiar with Central Supply, right? Or Water Street. It was a very simplified, more or less simple project at the time, 2011. Coming in for a building addition, they made some exterior renovations and added some office square footage. They also cleaned up the rest of the site and sort of formalized some of their access and circulation issues. But what we want to do tonight, we've already broken you up into 4 groups. There's Heritage, there's Conservation Commission, Zoning Board, and Planning Board. And what we'll do, basically when an application comes in, Planning Board ends up being the last step. Planning Board can't act until the Zoning Board has acted, because the Planning Board can't approve an application that doesn't comply with zoning. So if they need a variance or a special exception or a wetland permit, they have to get that first. So we're going to have the Zoning Board go before Planning. Zoning Board frequently looks to the Conservation Commission for guidance with looking at riverbank protection issues, wetland issues. Conservation Commission also provides input to the Department of Environmental Services at the state level. So they are sort of an input to the Zoning Board. So we'll have Conservation Commission go before zoning. Heritage can usually come first or last. It's actually up to the applicant, depending on their project and how they want to do it. In this case, and in many cases, they want to get at least a sense of whether the Historic Commission or the Heritage Commission is going to ask for changes that might ripple through all the other reviews. So they try to get that done first. So for tonight's application, we're going to have the Heritage Commission go first, and it's sort of got what it's looking at, and it's a discrete review process. It's not necessarily an input to any of the other boards and committees, but we'll have you go first. Conservation Commission will go second, Zoning Board third, and then wind up with the Planning Board last.
Right. So everybody needs to be good and approve your application, because if you deny it, we can't go to the next step.
Right.
Okay?
And if you deny it, it's already been built, so we got a real problem if anything denied. So again, this project actually did go to the Planning Board, and because it's actually a special exception use, it did go to the Zoning Board. For tonight's sort of hypothetical project, we're going to pretend that the Riverbank District existed in 2011 as a review process, as for conservation to weigh in on. And we're going to pretend that the Historic District somehow gets extended down to this section of Water Street. This is actually not technically in the Historic District as it exists today. But again, for the sake of this exercise, we're going to pretend that it did. So Rebecca normally works with the Heritage Commission, so she's going to walk you through that review process. Mark works with the Zoning Board. Mark works with Conservation Commission, and he'll guide you through that. Tim works with the Zoning Board and Planning Board, but he's going to just work with the Zoning Board tonight, and I'll work with the Planning Board. Please, absolutely. What have I missed?
So is this all they submit?
Well, that's a half-size copy.
Right, but it's just these plans, like this is what's submitted and that's what gets taken to the board.
For this application, there's one other page that you didn't get, and that's all of the project details about shrubs and catch basins and paving designs. But yes, this is a very simple project, simplified project. Some plan sets are 10 times this.
But it's the
30
plan set,
pages.
it's not a Bible of other, that's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, and then you get into the building permit process, and that's all the architectural designs, the materials, the electrical, plumbing, that's a whole different set, but yes. So this is fairly streamlined process, fairly streamlined project. So I think the plan tonight is to have each group work as a small group for about 15 or 20 minutes, go through the regulations and the excerpts that were provided to you, and then at the end of that, we'll report out. One person from each board and committee will report what you talked about, so that all the other boards sort of learn what your group did for the project.
Yep, and as you're going through and you're looking at the criteria that are applicable to your section of reviewing the plan, if you're looking at that criteria and you say, hey, we think that this, this should be approved, but there should be this condition in order to make that, you can, it's very, very, very common and basically happens all the time to grant conditional approvals. So things that need to happen later in the process in order to actually allow the site to get developed. So in your report out, feel free to add conditions.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll turn it over to each of our leaders, Tim, Mark, Rebecca, to sort of come up, I guess, stand or sit wherever, and guide your board through the process.
All right, so yeah, we'll get this started. Phil is going to report out on behalf of the Heritage Commission, but I'm hearing that everybody's going to chime in as needed, so we'll start with you.
Okay, yes, I made the mistake of taking some notes, so was strong-armed into being a spokesman, but everybody will jump in, I'm sure. So we're reviewing this application by Central Supply, longtime business in Lebanon, to put an addition to the front of their building and also make some changes in other parts of the building. We note that one of the criteria for studying an application like this is that if there's an addition or alteration or repair of an existing building and that it requires a building permit, we should do a review. What we've focused on is some aspects of the changes. For one thing, there's new siding being added to the whole existing wooden building, as far as we can tell, front and back. Some of that siding is infilling existing windows, particularly in the back. If you look at the last page of the plans, most of the existing windows in the back are being infilled with siding. It's really changing the look of the back and some of the front windows also. There's a new entry being added, some stairs up to it. They're making some changes in lighting, and a new loading dock is being added, changing the doors, we think, in the loading dock. Regarding the siding.
And the roof, yeah.
Oh,
Change.
that's
they
right.
add some roof part, yeah.
Right. The siding, as far as we can tell, is pretty much matching what existed before. They're just putting on new siding, except for those big infills of windows. The roof that they're adding is a metal roof in harmony with their existing addition, metal building. The new entry isn't just some kind of flat architectural thing. It has some nice features that fit with the era of the building and the buildings nearby, we think. On the windows that they are putting in, adding are okay in scale and type. They kind of match what's there already. So, before we go on to talk about our approval and condition, what have I missed?
No, I think that was
Covered all.
everything, yeah.
Okay. We are concerned about the windows. Especially in the back, all those windows being covered, there might be some old windows, and we'd like to see more windows preserved and understand why they feel the need to cover up all those windows. The building next door, the brick building, if you look at that, they have on both sides of the building, it's just filled with windows. This is really going to change the look. So,
Great. All right, so before they go for a building permit, we just want the windows, the issues with the windows addressed.
Mhm.
Great. Good.
Good job.
All right, so Conservation Commission, Becky is going to be reporting for behalf of them.
Sorry, we're not talking for two, but, so the purpose of the Riverbank Protection District is to protect the health, safety, and general welfare of the people of Lebanon, water quality and natural resources, and governing the use and land adjacent to the rivers and streams. And there's like 16 different waterways in Lebanon, and the one we're interested in here is the Mescoma River. So on the first and second page of the map or the drawing, you can see where the Mescoma River runs, and we've been working along the riverbank to see what we need to do. So the 4 recommendations that would be made, is there anything else just generally? The 4 recommendations that would be made to the planning board would be to establish edge of disturbance line, to because of the amount of impervious area in the proximity to the river, to encourage the planning board to review proposed stormwater management. 3, we applaud the applicant's removal of impervious surface area, but strongly encourage silt fencing be used during disturbance. And then 4, we applaud the dumpster enclosure and relocation further away from the river. So.
Wow, that's very good. It's a comprehensive review. Planning board's got a lot more work.
They actually did it, though, you
Yeah.
know, all that was done here, but
Yeah.
those should be the things.
Great. Karen, you're going to report on behalf of the zoning board.
Sure. So the zoning board did decide to approve the application for special exception. We looked at, so the reason this application had to come before the zoning board was that it's a pre-existing, non-conforming use in the central business district. Warehouses are not permitted in the central business district, according to the zoning ordinance, and it's a warehouse that was here before that ordinance was enacted. So because they want to expand the pre-existing non-conforming use, I'm smiling because we were having a little debate over the definition of the word expand in that. Then it has to come before the zoning board. But we thought it met the criteria. I think there were for not essentially being not a substantial change to either the use or the impact on the neighborhood or sort of gradations thereof. So we granted our special exception and passed it on to planning with no conditions. Thank you.
For coming straight to the planning board. So Renee and Kelly are going to be talking about this.
Okay, so planning board in this case was tasked with organizing the coordination of roads, traffic, and parking. The standards are made according to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. And with that in mind, the planning board
is going to assess the circulation and traffic flows of the proposed building, and a key consideration is if cars are able to pass safely within the parking areas, in particular, one car going by each other, if they're able to do so safely without any kind of accidents to occur. So, and in addition, we want to avoid any kind of traffic accidents, parking, make sure that there's adequate space to back out. And in the proposed plan, it was deemed that there was not adequate space on the right-hand side of the parking lot, and therefore the planning board recommends that this is a one-way passage. Additionally, there were considerations for the number of handicap spaces, which were deemed adequate, as well as making sure there was the ability of emergency vehicles to maneuver. They need a 50-foot radius in order to maneuver through the area, and that was also deemed sufficient. And lastly, with the parking spaces, we needed to make sure that they adhered to the recommended standard size of parking spaces. And most were deemed acceptable. However, parking space number 11 on the left-hand side was deemed too close to the wall, and therefore that will be removed. Again, one final small amendment is on the current plan. There are two listed sewer lines, which is not accurate. There's only one sewer line on this street, and the plan will need to be adjusted.
She nailed it.
Great. Yeah, no, that, you guys did a great job.
So, again, great job, everybody. That gives each of you a very quick sense of what the different boards and committees do in the context of the development review process. Sometimes it's a flat green field, and it's really easy to just pop a building in and put everything around it the way you would want. Other cases, you've got a 100-year-old building that's about 5 feet from a river that we're trying to protect, and it's a lot more difficult to sort of work around the regulations. Maybe it's already being used or has historically been used for use that you wouldn't necessarily want to continue in your downtown, and you have to work around those issues with special exceptions and riverbank protection and natural resource protection. Again, you can see on the plan, there's a catch basin close to where the new paving was going in, and the pipe goes straight to the river. That's not the way we would do things today, but that's how it was done years ago, and you have to work around that. That's part of the challenge and part of what makes it interesting to work on the development review side of planning and zoning and conservation and even heritage. For heritage, we definitely want to preserve some of these old buildings, even though they're maybe not where we would ideally like them to be. They're great old buildings. They're part of the charm and the character of Lebanon. They're generally very well built, better built than buildings are today. So there's great value in preserving them and making better use of them. That's part of preserving your historic character is continuing to use buildings in a productive way. So again, this is just a very cursory review of the development review process. Do we want to take a break or just keep flowing? Or?
Do you guys you feel like you need a break, or we're good? We'll just keep going? Everybody's good? Okay.
Do we want to talk a little bit more about what some of these what other things these boards and committees do? You want to start, Mark, with Conservation Commission? I know Concom's process in the development review, their role there is pretty limited compared to what they do more broadly.
Sure, I wrote down sort of the short list, and I think as you just experienced, they can have a role in development review, and as David mentioned, it's not that often that they do have a role in development review. Usually it'd be a significant, sizable project where the planning board would ask the Conservation Commission to provide some input related to the natural resources. I think the Timberwood Commons project was one, maybe Sleeper Village. And you may say, what you said, it's not, you just told me that it doesn't happen that often. And the reason is part of their other role is sort of big picture planning. So the development review process includes components such as looking at stormwater impacts, looking at landscaping. Well, the Conservation Commission has been sort of the voice over the years of saying, hey, make sure that's part of your process. What we've done, sort of put a lot of effort into in the past couple decades, is breaking down the silos. That's not the Conservation Commission who should be looking out for the water quality. That's good planning. And so we try to sort of, from that bigger picture, is make sure that the planning board is using all the tools at their disposal for good planning. And a couple of the other sort of functions of the Conservation Commission is, so they get involved with wetland permitting. It's actually a state Department of Environmental Services process, and the Conservation Commission's role is advisory, but they would review an application like this that's proposing to impact a wetland, and they'd provide comments to the state. They may say, we object to what's being proposed, or they may say that would be acceptable as long as these conditions were met, or what have you. And so that's part of what they do. They're engaged in education, awareness, and sort of hosting events. And so that could be stuff like sending out flyers to residents. One that they did last year was on the Healthy Lawns. I don't know if residents saw that flyer. It was basically encouraging landowners not to use herbicides and pesticides, especially in proximity to rivers. They could have an invasive species sort of work group that works towards education and removal of invasive species. Hanover's quite active in that area. And then they have, in terms of the event, we have a Wild About Lebanon series where we have hikes on various conservation properties, and there's 7 or 8 of these events scheduled for this year. And then sort of lastly, probably the part I enjoy the most is there's 21 miles of trail that's on city-owned conservation land, and there's 2,000 acres of city-owned conservation land ranging from Boston Lot to Farnham Hill, Signal Hill. And so the Conservation Commission is really sort of serve as the stewards of those properties. And so if they're properties that are near and dear to you, and you have ideas as to how to best manage them, whether they should have a new trail, or whether the summit should be cleared, or maybe we should do a logging operation, or whatever it may be, it gives you a voice at the table for those properties when you're on the Conservation Commission. So that's more or less it in a nutshell.
Tim, you want to cover the zoning board? I mean, we sort of covered that last time.
Sure. Quickly. The zoning board it's probably best to look at them as they are, which is a quasi-judicial body. They really sit in judgment, if you will, of applications that come before them, and that is their statutory charge. What we were talking earlier about how the zoning board is not, it's not the good idea board. It's not if you bring something that makes sense but isn't allowed by the zoning ordinance, that alone is not a basis for the zoning to make a decision at all. They're constrained in what they can do by the criteria that have been established by state statute to evaluate variance requests. And again, a variance request is asking the board to do something that you're not allowed to do. It's almost like an appeals board, sort of. In fact, that's how a lot of boards' applications are referred to in other municipalities. They call them appeals. You're appealing to the zoning board. I don't like that terminology, but it does make sense in some ways. So the zoning board is not a policy-making body. They don't come up with the zoning ordinance. It's not their idea. The zoning ordinance is a policy document adopted by the council. And so it's the zoning board's job as sort of an independent body to to arbiter disputes about the meaning and the interpretation of the zoning ordinance through administrative appeals. But again, much more commonly is a variance where if you apply the general regulations to a specific piece of property, it would create an unnecessary hardship because of the unique conditions of that property. So it's very property specific. And there are very specific criteria that an applicant has to demonstrate. If they meet those criteria, then the board is authorized to grant the variance. If each and every one of those criteria are not met, if the applicant doesn't meet their burden, the zoning board can't grant the variance, no matter how great of an idea it might be. Again, they're sort of like a safety valve to make sure that the city isn't the city's regulations aren't unfairly impacting a particular piece of property, because there may be something strange about that property that makes it difficult to comply with the zoning ordinance. So they serve an incredibly important function, but it's not. I think it would be fun to serve on a zoning board, but I'm sure my view is skewed. But they have a very specific and important role, and they do sort of serve as an appeals board. The other thing, so yeah, the administrative appeals, where there's a disagreement about what the zoning ordinance means. There's a variance where there's something unique about the property that makes it difficult to comply with the regulations. The zoning board has the power to grant a variance if the criteria are met by the applicant. And then finally, they are authorized to grant special exceptions, which are provisions in our zoning ordinance that require a heightened level of review. So we use the example of a group daycare facility in the central business district. If you want to open one, you'd have to go to the zoning board for what's called a special exception. And if you meet the special exception criteria, then the board is authorized to grant approval for that specific use. So that is what the zoning board does. It's not policy making. It's not legislative, but they serve a really critical function. Thank you.
Can I ask what the language question was about expansion?
It's just that a very important concept in zoning is our non-conforming uses, and a legal non-conforming use is something that predates the enactment of the ordinance, and under state law and really under the state constitution, you're entitled to maintain a non-conforming use, even though a zoning ordinance or a zoning ordinance provision has been adopted that now makes that use not permitted in the district or the building. It makes it non-conforming. So there's lots of non-conformities all around the city. There may be old houses that are within the setback, or there may be like the Little Store. The Little Store is a great example of a non-conforming use. But as long as that, more or less, as long as that use continues, you can change owners, you can, change, product to a certain extent, I guess. But as long as it stays a retail store, it can continue, even though it's definitely not permitted in the R2 district, which is right, it's R2, which is where it's located. So we call it a legal non-conforming use. It's grandfathered. But how you determine whether it's actually a non-conforming use or not it can get very complicated very quickly. There are so many nuances to it, and then it becomes doubly confusing when you talk about expanding that non-conforming use, particularly when you're expanding it into when you're enlarging the building which it's located in to accommodate that expansion of the use. The law, we have a provision in our zoning ordinance that seems to address that squarely, and that's what we addressed tonight. But it's very complex, and it's not entirely clear to me what that provision is designed to address. But so it's sort of a nuance. That's all. But the law, the law of non-conforming uses is very important and very complex. But it comes up a lot.
Who set the original zones, and when was that done?
1978, prior to, but 1978 was the big, what we have today.
In Lebanon, there was a 1938 zoning ordinance. I think that's the first one in Lebanon. I think there was sort of residential and not residential. It was very simple. It was a booklet about 10 pages or less.
No, well, isn't it? I thought it was more. We have it. We actually have it. It's really cool, but
Yeah.
I thought it. Yeah, it's.
But then it's been updated over the years, and it's gotten more and more complex, and as the nature of communities go.
Yeah, it was a
Is that
booklet,
a planning commission, a planning board thing, or who actually goes out and makes that determination?
I think it would have been the town council at that time. We said Lebanon was still a town in 1938. I don't know that there was a planning board in 1938, so it would have been the town council, select board.
Were things allowed
Right.
to change a lot after the fire in '64?
Allowed to change.
I mean, as far as business, you know, where the business buildings and residential, or, because I know a good portion of the town burned down.
Yeah.
Yeah, the city council brought in what is now the Lebanon Housing Authority. In state law, any kind of development authority like that has the ability to do rural redevelopment, so to say.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, and even though the basic zone, the underlying zoning within the downtown didn't change,
Yeah.
certainly the landscape of the
Yeah,
town
certainly
changed.
did, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, it was
But-
still a central business district, sort of downtown type
There
commercial
used to be
uses.
a road right down where
the
the
mall.
Oh, the
Yeah.
mall, you know.
Yeah,
and
yeah, that was
you know, they
Hanover
used to
Street.
graze cows and stuff in the green.
Right on
and
the out, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And to get back to what Becky was just saying, so when we talked about master planning last week, that plays a huge role in how you're looking at your future zoning.
So is that like the 38 and then updated, what, in the 60s or 70s?
Yep.
Well, how often does that get updated, like 25 years or 10 years or?
So as we become more developed, the changes decrease, right? Because you've got way more established uses in these zones that were created along the way. And so in 1978, our landscape was totally different than what it is today. You know, like all of Route 120 was farmland, and 12A was farmland. So creating those zones and allowing that development restricts, in a way, what we can do in the future. Like we can create, we can't make more land, right? So looking at rural areas and how we want to protect that, we don't want that to be rezoned to allow for, you know, bigger growth without, you know, outside of our central boundary, like where we have water and sewer already. And so there's a lot of things that go into that type of a conversation. We have long-term maintenance kind of things, and how much more do we want to push people out of the center of town, and so, yeah, so those are big conversations for sure.
Just quickly expand on all those things. So we had a master plan adopted in 2012. It's essentially putting your ear to the people, what are the residents desiring? And then that has a future land use plan now. Then over the past 4 or 5 years, we've been updating zoning to reflect that.
Okay.
So you express your vision, and update the zoning tool.
Yeah.
So like when 12A, that was, I'm glad you said that, so when that came up, was, you know, whatever, my husband might call it the cluster, but anyway, what, you know, when they made the decision, we're gonna do this retail thing here, then that was agriculture or whatever it was zoned, and then they came in and rezoned it into commercial at that time.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was right. It was sort of mid-60s because right after the fire, the interstate was coming through. The businesses in downtown that wanted to reopen, downtown didn't get back on its feet for several years. The interstate came through and opened up all new areas like Miracle Mile and 12A that weren't previously commercial. So, and again, Tim mentioned non-conforming uses. It's not impossible to change your zoning, but we try to avoid creating non-conforming uses because it is sort of difficult for them, you know, the owners there to either continue to do what they do and have sort of reasonable natural expansions to their businesses or to make other relatively minor changes. So we try to avoid that when possible, but sometimes it's not possible. So, but it's all complicated.
What happens when philosophy changes? So 78, sure, there was probably industrial, resident, whatever. Now philosophy is more mixed use, exchange more stuff. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, we continue to amend. We do little nips and tucks at our zoning ordinance. We allow multifamily in our general commercial zone now. We allow residential development in an industrial park for example. We try to facilitate the kind of mixed use that we think fits the right way in the community, and all of that goes through the development review process, and to make sure that on the ground you're not going to have residences next to a factory, but maybe next to an office would be fine. Things like that. You do nips and tucks, but we haven't had substantial. I think there was the big zoning ordinance in '78. There was another one in 1990. And there hasn't really been a major change since 1990. So we're coming on 30 years where we've only made subtle changes to our zoning and our zoning map.
Right, but our map didn't change substantially in 90, the ordinance did.
So, yeah,
So
right.
the map that is currently existing today was created and adopted and has been in place since 1970.
So 40 years.
Yeah.
And zoning changes get voted on, right? Or some do?
They always get voted on by the council. There was a citizens ballot initiative in the late 80s that made certain changes within residential zones subject to the full citywide ballot, which is, I think we're unlike any other community in the state in that regard, because most cities, the city council as the elected body has the power to change zoning, but the citizens have sort of taken that back to a certain degree in Lebanon. So
Very difficult to change zoning here, unfortunately. That's the advantage of being a city. You don't the council with a public hearing could adopt a zoning change anytime they want, but we've adopted an incredibly onerous process. So it's not easy at all to change zoning ordinance. And there may be very good reasons for that, but that does sort of take away one of the nice things about being a city as opposed to a town where the town can only make zoning changes once a year at town meeting. And so we've sort of done that to ourselves in a way. We sort of accidentally.
So I want to be cognizant of the time. I want to make sure that these are all great questions, but I want to make sure we get a chance to hear about what else Heritage Commission does and the Planning Board. And then there's a whole slew of other boards and committees that we haven't even talked about yet. So Rebecca, want to cover the Heritage?
Yeah, so tonight the focus was on the regulatory role of the Heritage Commission. We don't always discuss regulatory items at every meeting, and that is founded in having a historic district, the Colburn Park Historic District. At some future point, we might have a West Lebanon district. There's been a lot of study of the Cross Avenue area, and that could be part of that district. So other aspects of the Heritage Commission's work, just to break it down into some of the working groups that we have, and there are actually 3 members here tonight between the books and Karen, so they might correct me even. But the 3 groups are the Dana House Working Group, the Fountain Working Group, and then we have a Special Projects Working Group. The Dana House, even before the Heritage Commission was established, had a lot of attention from the Historical Society, and I don't even know what it was the members of the Heritage Commission were called before. Was it just a Dana House? Dana House. Yeah. So their focus has been to not just to keep it going with repairs, but to figure out what its history is, so that if the idea is to preserve things, and that's one of the goals of the Heritage Commission, is to preserve community assets wherever possible. And this is a city-owned property located just up Seminary Hill next to the school district building. How would they do that? So there have been many studies, and we finally reached a point where it's time to make some decisions. And we know the roof needs to be repaired, but what about the inside? So right now they're developing an action plan, and that's taken time at every meeting. We have some funds from Robert Levitt, who was really dedicated to the Dana House. We've had collaboration with the Historical Society, and eventually we hope to have some programming and public input about what that'll be in the coming months. So to make it accessible and to reflect not just its exact previous uses, but the general history of the Connecticut River Valley settlement. With the Fountain Working Group, I don't know how many of you know it, Lebanon's been referred to as the city of fountains. I think there are about 7 of them between Lebanon and West Lebanon. 3 alone around the downtown Colburn Park area. The newer mall fountain with the animals, and some were destroyed with fires, and we don't have all of our historical fountains in place anymore. There's the Colburn Park fountain right in the center, and then the Golden Girl with the umbrella next to the Marion Carter Mansion. And then most recently, Fountain Working Group worked really hard to bring attention to the disrepair of the Glenwood Cemetery fountain, which is near Storrs Hill. And they've been piecing together old parts, trying to design new parts over the years, and funding's been the gap, and an amount of Stoner came forward to fill that gap. So that project is going to move forward. And that's one of the, probably the capstone projects for them. Special Projects Group is relatively new, but right now working on reviving the landmark designation program. For a while there was a high volume of selecting buildings throughout the community, not just in the historic district, that have an interesting history. They're still standing. We'd like to recognize the current owners for the work they've done to maintain them. Right now, we're working with Alice Peck Day Hospital for the Peck Homestead, one of their buildings along the frontage on Muscoma Street, to create a designation there. And there's nothing regulatory about it. It's just a really nice way to document the special elements of a property, and again, encourage the owners and bring awareness in the community. I don't know, I think this was a Fountain Working Group project. It was before my time, but the mall kiosk, there are a lot of informational installations downtown, and there's a kiosk, and one side of the kiosk is maintained by the Heritage Commission right now. I'll get to what it's about in a minute, but there's a project featured there. We do a lot of work with the state. As with most projects, they require money, and Lebanon is a certified local government, which there's an extensive application process for, which included having a Heritage Commission in the first place. And the certified local government funds have enabled us to contribute some local match funding, but then to work with the state on not just reporting, but also getting their professional input on projects like a citywide historical resources survey. The funding allowed us to get professional contracts, and then out of what we learned from things like that, we learned what are priority areas in the city to study even more, or a historic district, or some more landmark designations, or things like that. So more recently, we did a Mills of Lebanon study. I don't know if any of you saw that, and maybe even some of the buildings around the project that we reviewed today are covered in that. Anything along the river, you have to assume, may have been related to Mills at one point. And that all these studies are available on the Heritage Commission's website if you're interested. And that's one of the feature stories in the mall kiosk. In terms of some support roles,
I don't want
sure.
to cut you off, but I do want to have a little bit of a planning board and get to some of the other boards and committees.
Yep. I'll just mention very quickly, they also collaborate with the Arts and Culture Committee, Cemetery Task Force, Enfield Shaker Village Scenic Byway Committee, and I already mentioned the Historical Society.
And from the planning board standpoint, we've already covered a lot of what the planning board focuses on. Last meeting, we talked about the master plan. That's That's the one function that by statute they are required to do. If you have a planning board, they are required to create and amend a master plan from time to time. They're also very integral, or probably the key part of the development review process, and how different uses of land end up taking shape. Once it gets decided that that it's an allowed use, the planning board looks at how that use is going to come to fruition. We focused on parking and circulation just to keep it simple, but they look at grading and drainage, they look at landscaping, lighting, they look at the building and elevation views and making sure buildings don't block out light and air from surrounding properties. It's a very comprehensive overview for the development process. Even beyond that, the planning board has, Tim mentioned that the zoning board is not the good idea board. That's not their role. They're interpreters and arbiters. The planning board kind of is the good idea board. They are the ones who they don't have final say in adopting the zoning ordinance, as we've talked about, but they get to initiate a lot of the ideas about adding mixed use and where to change zoning and where to think about that based on the master plan, based on the ideas that come out of the community meetings and conversations about what it is, where we want to go with the master plan. That all feeds into the zoning ordinance, and the planning board has a big role in that, even though they're not the final adopter of that plan. The development regulations go a long way to deciding how things look and function in terms of what we've talked about tonight, and beyond that, they have a role to play in some of the capital budgeting. They complete the capital improvement program is a planning board function, and that's where the board takes the master plan and looks at where growth is anticipated, what kinds of facilities and infrastructure are going to be necessary to accommodate that growth that's anticipated, and then how do we budget for those big ticket items, those road repavements and bridge repavements and purchasing properties for conservation. Those big ticket items that are 50,000 and up or have a very long life. So the planning board plays that role in adopting and crafting the capital improvement budget, which effectively looks at least 6 years out. So we're constantly trying to anticipate the needs of the community and be prepared to budget for them and plan for them. And then we pass up the first year of that 6-year budget gets passed up to the council as part of the annual budget, which I think you may have already talked about in the first class budgeting. So the planning board has a role to play there. Beyond these four, these are the statutory land use boards. There are many more boards and committees in the community, depending on what your interests are. There's Ped and Bike Committee, Ped and Bike Advisory Committee, that's council created. They are advisory back to the council, but they're also asked to provide input to the planning department process, planning board process, when there ought to be a sidewalk or a bike lane or something built into a project. There's the Arts and Culture, it's not a task force, it's a commission now. Arts and Culture Commission just created, not even fully up and running yet, but they're, as the name suggests, they're going to focus on what the community can do to sort of heighten and promote the arts, which is something we have a wealth of already. How do we promote those organizations to the betterment of all of us within the community? There's the Energy Advisory Committee. That's another, if solar and wind and those kinds of things are your passion, you can get involved with the Energy Advisory Committee. There's a Class 6 Road Committee that's loosely tied to conservation, because these are the very, very old roads that existed in Lebanon going back 220 years, going back to when it was first founded. There were roads created that were public roads, and over time they got discontinued in a sense. People stopped using them, but they still exist and they're still public. So you can walk down a Class 6 road. Many of them are gated, but you can walk right down the old Kings Highway that runs along the north edge of Farnham Hill is a Class 6 road. And again, it's a public road. The city doesn't maintain it, but the access is there. And those roads go all over the place, all over the city. There are roads where all you can see are sort of the stone walls and sort of the ruts. That might all be all that's left of them, but they're still there and they're still public rights of way. So the Class 6 Road Committee looks at those and proposes policy changes as to whether it ought to stay a Class 6 road, be promoted back to Class 5 where it would be paved and fixed and used for vehicles, or maybe downgraded to Class A trails or Class B trails. There's the SCIMP committee. We talked a little bit about that last time. That's implementation of the master plan. There's an economic vitality exchange committee, which was created a number of years ago to sort of facilitate better communication and coordination between Lebanon city government and the business community within the city, to strengthen ties and bonds there. They're actively involved in some of the downtown development and the TIF district, the creation of a TIF district there. The TIF district itself is a new advisory board. Again, one that's just created last fall, not even up and running yet, but they will help decide how to spend the money that is generated within the TIF district to provide the infrastructure and improvements within the TIF district to facilitate more growth, more development, and more TIF increment. So there's Mascoma River Local Advisory Committee. There's an adaptation work group that's heavily involved in sort of climate change and what that means for the community, how we're reacting to changes in the climate and weather, from farming and forestry to business operations and things like that. There's a Transportation Management Association, which we coordinate with Vital Communities on, and that's about trying to get single occupancy vehicles off the roads as much as possible, get people to carpool or use alternative modes to get where they're going around the city. That's just a handful of some of the boards and committees. We've actually gotten rid of a number of boards and committees over the years because we've had trouble getting enough members to sit on those and fill those seats and provide that role. But basically, as I said, if whatever your interests might be around the city, from arts to energy to sustainability and ped bike, there's probably a board or committee that you could get involved with to participate and have an influence and have a real opportunity to benefit your community. So I'll turn it back to Paula.
Thank you. All right, so I just wrote down a couple of notes because I wanted to make sure that I touched on a few things before we leave tonight. And one, I think one of the most important, sorry David, I'm standing right in front of you. It's okay. Okay. So one of the most important aspects of all of this that I'm hoping that you guys grasped is that the term planning is a very large umbrella, right? There's so much that comes underneath it. And it's not sometimes viewed as one of the most exciting things that take place in your city. But it truly is like the overarching thing that brings about the community. And the goal of this, to try to introduce you, those of you that don't already serve, because I know there are a number of you here that do in some capacity, that the community is a bigger success with the more involvement that we have. And, you know, people come to the libraries, you know, people have interactions on all different levels. But when I think about what we're talking about tonight, everything that's happening in all of the subjects that we talked about last week and tonight are administered mainly by the 4 people that are here with you tonight. support staff that is in their office, plus some building inspectors that go out and, you know, make sure that all the approvals that have taken place are in compliance with building codes. So it's a lot, and we count on everybody. So the more that your interest is piqued, and the more that you're willing to share your information with your neighbors, with your friends, with, you know, whomever you think might have an interest, we have a place for them. So I just encourage that. So an upcoming opportunity that I'm hoping that all of you will participate in, it's not going to be until early May, is the actual planning of the tunnel in downtown. Right? So we went through the downtown visioning process a number of years ago, looking at how everything, you know, the redevelopment of the area. Well, this is like the big kickoff to all of that. It's going to be open to make the connection between the Northern Rail Trail and Mascoma Greenway. We have lots of opportunities. So eyes and ears open for that, because it'll happen after all of this is done. But, which leads me to that on our website, which the task sheet that you all got the first night, there's an opportunity for you to go on the website and basically build your own dashboard. So if there are items that you're particularly interested in, things that are happening around the city, you can subscribe to those. So as information gets updated with agendas or on boards and committee pages, or things that are happening in recreation, things that are going on in the libraries, all that information can just come to you. You don't have to go and search for it. So I encourage you to definitely make sure you do that. And this tonight is the first time we've worked in this fashion. So I'm really, really interested in feedback. So please definitely fill out your surveys. We want you to do that every week anyways, but the more feedback that you can give us to help us improve this part of it would be really appreciated. Next week there is a change in the schedule. We've had something come up that we're going to be switching our city clerk week with our library recreation week. So while we were going to be at City Hall next week, we're going to be back here one more week. And library and recreation will be, it's going to be a bit of an extended class. Because we want to give them each an hour and a half rather than just an hour. So the class will go until 9 o'clock next week.
And those of you that use Outlook, because I send out all the invitations, this is where one of those times where this will be helpful, because I will go in and change that so that you can update it in your calendars as to where you're supposed to be.
So does anybody have any questions before we leave? I hope you enjoyed what we went through and the process, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.